Picture the coldest night you've ever experienced, the kind that makes your face hurt just stepping outside. And then imagine it lasting for months. Not one brutal cold snap, months of it, followed by a summer that barely deserved the name, followed by another winter just as unforgiving. Now imagine living through that, every single year, for generation after generation, with no heated buildings, no synthetic insulation, and no way of knowing it would ever end.
Do you think you could survive the Ice Age? Let us know your strategy in the comments below.
There was no forecast telling anyone this would eventually pass. No historical record of a previous warm period to hold on to for hope. As far as anyone alive during the coldest stretches of this period could have known, this was simply what the world was, permanently, and it had always been this way, and it would presumably continue exactly like this for as long as anyone's children or grandchildren would ever live. That psychological reality, living inside a crisis with no promised end date, is worth sitting with before getting into the specific survival strategies, because it shaped every decision these communities made. This wasn't one bad winter. This was the climate, for thousands of years, across huge stretches of the planet, during a period we now call the last glacial maximum, roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago at its most extreme. Massive ice sheets covered much of what's now northern Europe, northern Asia, and North America. Average temperatures were dramatically colder than today, and the margin between staying alive and freezing to death, for a species not built for Arctic conditions, was thinner than most people realize. Human bodies, on a purely biological level, are not naturally suited to this kind of environment at all. We evolved in warm African climates, with relatively little natural body hair, sweat glands built for cooling rather than insulation, and none of the specialized fat layers or fur that genuinely cold-adapted animals rely on. Every single survival advantage humans had against extreme cold, every single one, had to come from technology, behavior, and social cooperation, rather than anything already built into the body by evolution. That's the central tension this entire story revolves around. The animal hides they'd always worn simply weren't enough anymore. Loosely draped fur, tied roughly at the shoulders, works reasonably well in mild cold. It does almost nothing against the kind of sustained, brutal cold that defined the Ice Age. Wind finds every gap. Body heat escapes constantly. A person dressed this way, exposed to genuinely Arctic conditions for any length of time, is in real, immediate danger, no matter how thick the fur they're wearing happens to be. So somebody solved a problem that sounds almost too simple to matter, right up until you realize how much it actually did. A needle with an eye. Small enough to lose in the snow. Big enough to change everything about how humans experienced cold for the rest of history. Before the eyed needle, clothing meant wrapping and tying. After it, clothing meant sewing, which meant something completely different was suddenly possible. Tailored, fitted garments, cut and stitched to actually match the shape of a human body, with multiple layers that trapped warm air against the skin instead of letting it escape through every gap in a loosely draped hide. Fitted clothing meant trapped air, layered insulation, and a body that finally stayed warm through conditions that would have been genuinely fatal in the old draped hide approach. Multiple layers, each one thin, each one doing relatively little on its own, combined to trap pockets of warm air between them. The exact same principle every modern winter coat still relies on. The difference between survivable and fatal cold in an environment like this often came down to exactly this kind of layered, fitted construction. Archaeologists have actually found these needles and dated them with real precision. Eyed bone needles, made from carefully shaped and drilled animal bone, start showing up clearly in the archaeological record around 40,000 years ago, right around the time modern humans were pushing into the coldest parts of Ice Age Eurasia. The timing isn't a coincidence. It's a technology that appeared exactly when and where the problem it solved became a matter of life and death. Making one of these needles was itself a genuinely demanding technical achievement, worth appreciating in its own right. A small, thin sliver of bone had to be shaped, smoothed, and then, most difficult of all, precisely drilled through at one end to create an eye small enough to hold sinew thread without splitting the surrounding bone. Experimental archaeologists who've attempted to recreate this process using only Stone Age tools and techniques describe it as slow, exacting work, requiring real skill and patience to avoid cracking the delicate needle at exactly the point where it needed to be strongest. This wasn't a lucky accident. It was a deliberately engineered solution to a specific, well-understood problem. The significance goes beyond just staying slightly warmer, too. Fitted, layered clothing meant humans could remain active outdoors for extended periods even in extreme cold, which mattered enormously for hunting, gathering fuel, and maintaining the kind of mobility a hunter-gatherer lifestyle absolutely required. A population that could only survive by staying huddled inside shelter constantly would have struggled to gather enough food to actually make it through an Ice Age winter. Clothing that allowed genuine outdoor activity, not just passive survival, was the difference between a viable, sustainable way of life and a slow, inevitable decline. Clothing alone wasn't going to be enough, even fitted, well-insulated clothing. They needed somewhere to actually live, some kind of shelter substantial enough to hold in warmth and block wind entirely, in a landscape that, in the coldest regions, offered almost no trees for building material and no caves conveniently located everywhere people needed to be. At a site now called Mezerich, in what's now Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered something that sounds almost unbelievable the first time you hear it described. Houses built entirely from the bones of woolly mammoths. Large curved tusks and mandibles arranged as structural framework, skulls and long bones stacked and interlocked to form load-bearing walls, the entire structure likely covered with hides for additional insulation and weatherproofing. Multiple mammoth bone dwellings have been found at this single site, suggesting a genuine settlement, not a one-off shelter built out of desperation. The engineering involved becomes even more impressive once you look closely at how these structures were actually assembled. Researchers studying the Mezerich site identified distinct construction techniques: tusks arranged in interlocking arches to distribute structural weight, skulls stacked in specific patterns that maximize stability, and long bones used almost like modern framing timber, positioned to bear load in exactly the directions where it mattered most. This level of consistent, repeated structural logic across multiple separate dwellings suggests genuine architectural knowledge, passed down and refined, rather than improvised trial and error each time. Building something like this required an enormous amount of coordinated effort. A single mammoth bone structure at sites like this could incorporate the remains of dozens of individual mammoths, bones that had to be sourced, transported, and precisely fitted together into a stable, weather-resistant structure without any metal tools, blueprints, or modern construction techniques of any kind. This wasn't improvised shelter, it was genuine architecture, planned and executed by people who clearly understood structural principles well enough to build something that stayed standing through an Ice Age winter. It's worth considering where all those mammoth bones actually came from, too, because the answer says something important about how these communities operated. Some of the bones show evidence of having been scavenged from animals that died naturally, rather than all being freshly hunted, meaning these groups were also strategically gathering and stockpiling building material over time. Another layer of forward planning on top of the construction itself. Managing a resource pipeline like that, tracking where usable bones might be found, coordinating their transport back to a settlement site, and stockpiling them for eventual use represents a level of long-term planning that goes well beyond simply reacting to the cold as it happened. Inside those structures, fire did more than just provide light. It was the actual difference between a survivable interior temperature and a fatal one. And Ice Age hearths show clear evidence of careful, deliberate management rather than casual, occasional use. Archaeologists studying hearth remains at cold climate sites have found evidence of sustained, carefully maintained fires, positioned specifically to maximize heat retention within enclosed structures, using fuel sources adapted to a landscape with limited wood, including bone itself, which burns surprisingly well once a fire is hot enough to sustain it. Keeping a fire burning through an entire Ice Age winter was itself a genuinely demanding logistical challenge, one that required constant attention and real skill. Fuel had to be gathered, dried, and stockpiled well ahead of need, since a sudden shortage in the depths of winter could be genuinely fatal. Someone needed to actively tend the fire through the night, every night, for months at a time, a responsibility that likely rotated among capable adults and represented a serious, ongoing time investment for the entire group, not a background task handled casually. Diet had to change dramatically too, and it centered on one specific resource that made an enormous amount of sense once you understand what a human body actually needs to survive extreme cold. Fat. Specifically, enormous quantities of animal fat, the kind found in genuine abundance in the megafauna that dominated Ice Age landscapes. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, giant deer, animals whose sheer size meant a single successful hunt could feed a group for an extended period. Fat isn't just calories in cold environments. It's specifically the kind of calorie-dense fuel a human body needs to generate enough internal heat to survive sustained freezing temperatures in a way that lean protein alone simply can't match efficiently. A body relying too heavily on lean protein without adequate fat intake, a condition sometimes informally called rabbit starvation by researchers studying historical Arctic diets, can actually become dangerously malnourished even while technically eating enough calories, because the body simply can't process that much protein without adequate fat to balance it. Isotopic analysis of Ice Age human remains consistently shows diets extremely high in animal fat and protein, far higher than earlier or later human populations in warmer climates, exactly the pattern you'd expect from people whose survival depended on maximizing fat intake from every successful hunt. This dietary reality shaped hunting strategy itself in specific, documented ways. Certain body parts of large Ice Age animals, particularly fat deposits around organs and beneath the skin, appear to have been specifically targeted and prioritized based on butchery patterns found at kill sites, rather than animals simply being processed indiscriminately for whatever meat happened to be available. Groups weren't just hunting for calories in general, they were hunting specifically for the kind of calories that would actually keep them alive through the coldest months. Survival wasn't just physical either. It was deeply social, and the archaeological evidence for that is genuinely remarkable once you know what to look for. Materials found at Ice Age sites, specific types of shell, particular stone used for tool making, sometimes show up hundreds of kilometers from where they naturally occur, evidence of trade or exchange networks stretching across enormous distances between different groups who had never met each other directly. Some of the most striking examples involve marine shells found at sites hundreds of kilometers from any coastline, clearly transported through a chain of exchanges between neighboring groups rather than carried by a single individual on one long journey. Tracing where specific tool-making stone actually originated, using its distinct mineral composition, has allowed researchers to map out surprisingly extensive exchange networks connecting Ice Age communities across huge stretches of Europe, networks that had to be actively maintained through repeated contact, not just a single lucky encounter between strangers. That kind of long-distance exchange network mattered enormously in an environment this harsh, because it meant no single group was ever entirely isolated. A community hit by a catastrophically bad hunting season or a localized crisis wiping out a critical resource had connections to other groups who might be doing better that particular year. Connections built through years of exchanged materials, shared knowledge, and almost certainly intermarriage between neighboring groups. Isolation, in an environment capable of killing an entire group through a single bad season, was genuinely dangerous. Connection to other groups, even distant ones, functioned as a kind of insurance policy against local catastrophe. These networks likely served purposes well beyond simple material exchange, too. Shared gatherings between otherwise separate groups would have offered opportunities to exchange practical knowledge: which hunting grounds were currently productive, which water sources remained reliable, which techniques were working well for surviving the current conditions. Information, just as much as physical materials, was almost certainly flowing through these same long-distance connections, giving groups access to a much wider pool of accumulated environmental knowledge than any single community could gather alone. Which brings us to the group that had every advantage and still didn't make it through. Neanderthals had been living in cold, glacial-adjacent parts of Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans ever arrived there, adapted through countless generations to exactly this kind of environment, with bodies specifically shaped by evolution for cold climate survival, stockier builds, larger nasal cavities for warming incoming air, and physical strength that consistently outmatched contemporary modern humans in raw terms. Neanderthals had been cold adapted for hundreds of thousands of years longer than we had, and by most straightforward physical measures, they should have had the advantage in exactly this environment. And yet Neanderthals went extinct sometime around 40,000 years ago, during a period of significant additional climate instability, at almost precisely the same time modern humans were expanding successfully into the same cold regions Neanderthals had occupied for so long. It's worth being clear about just how physically capable Neanderthals actually were, because it makes their eventual extinction genuinely puzzling rather than an obvious, predictable outcome. Skeletal evidence indicates Neanderthals were, on average, considerably stronger than contemporary modern humans, with denser bones and more robust muscle attachment points suggesting significantly greater raw physical power. Their body proportions, shorter limbs relative to torso size, closely match the pattern seen in modern cold-adapted human populations today, a body shape that minimizes heat loss through reduced surface area. Every straightforward physical indicator points toward a population extremely well-equipped for exactly the environment that ultimately proved fatal to them. Researchers studying this transition have found tantalizing but genuinely incomplete evidence about exactly what tipped the balance. Some archaeological sites suggest Neanderthal clothing and shelter technology, while real and functional, may not have matched the specific innovations modern humans were bringing into these same regions around the same time, fitted, sewn clothing among them. Evidence for eyed needles specifically, the technology this video opened with, is notably sparse or absent at Neanderthal sites compared to contemporary modern human sites in similar environments, suggesting Neanderthals may have relied primarily on the older draped hide approach, even as conditions grew more extreme. Trade and exchange networks connecting distant Neanderthal groups appear less extensive in the archaeological record compared to contemporary modern human networks, potentially leaving Neanderthal populations more vulnerable to localized bad seasons without the same safety net of distant trading partners. Some researchers have also pointed to differences in group size and social structure, with modern human sites from this period sometimes showing evidence of larger, more interconnected communities compared to what's typically found at contemporary Neanderthal sites, a difference that could have meaningfully affected each population's resilience during an unusually harsh and unpredictable stretch of climate. None of this is fully settled science, and researchers actively debate how much weight to put on any single explanation. Climate instability itself, disease, competition for the same resources, and small-scale genetic factors likely all played some role alongside whatever technological and social differences existed. But the pattern is genuinely striking, regardless of the exact mechanism. A population supremely physically adapted for cold, with hundreds of thousands of years of practice living in exactly this environment, didn't make it through a period that a comparatively recent arrival, us, managed to survive and expand through instead. The species that made it through wasn't necessarily the toughest, the strongest, or the most naturally cold adapted. It was the one that kept inventing, kept refining small pieces of technology like an eyed needle, kept building increasingly sophisticated shelter, kept maintaining social connections across distances that would have been genuinely dangerous to navigate alone. Survival, in this specific case, seems to have depended less on what evolution had already built into the body, and more on what a resourceful, socially connected, endlessly tinkering species could build on top of it. There's a broader lesson buried in this comparison that's worth sitting with, beyond just the specific story of two human species and one brutal climate period. Physical adaptation, the kind that takes hundreds of thousands of years of evolution to develop, turned out to matter less than the ability to rapidly invent, adopt, and share new solutions within a single lifetime. That's a genuinely different kind of survival strategy than anything most other species have access to, and this particular chapter of the Ice Age may be one of the clearest, earliest demonstrations of exactly how powerful that strategy could be, even when pitted directly against a population with every conceivable physical advantage. Every one of us alive today is descended from people who looked at conditions that killed off an entire physically better adapted human species and found a way through anyway. Not through brute toughness alone, but through a small bone needle, a wall built from mammoth bones, a carefully tended fire, and a trade route stretching to a group of strangers hundreds of kilometers away who might, one day, need to return the favor. That combination, technology, shelter, and connection, carried a fragile, comparatively soft-bodied species through an ice age that should have, by every physical measure, favored someone else entirely.
If you enjoyed this journey into the Ice Age, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more incredible stories from history.